Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, and Jean-Paul Sartre was offered the Nobel Prize for Literature and he turned it down. Bertrand Russell actually won it. Thomas More is a literal saint. These are titans, great minds standing astride the history of Western thought, and every one of them is going to prove to us today that you can be absolutely brilliant at philosophy and absolutely dogshit at writing a novel. Yes, these intellectual giants are all on today's list. But where? Did they nail it or did they fail it? Let's find out on this episode of Philosophical Book Club, where some philosophers attempt to write a novel and not all of them make it out alive. So why would a philosopher want to write a novel anyway? You'd think if you had something important to say about the nature of reality or ethics or the meaning of human life, you'd just say it. Write a treatise, publish a paper, go on a podcast, maybe start a Substack if you're really desperate. So why would you bury your ideas inside a story about a guy who moves to a coastal town and starts having feelings about a chestnut tree, or something like that? Not that I'm writing something like that, it's an elm. But anyway, I think there are 3 good reasons why you might do this. The first is the oldest trick in the book, and it's the one your high school English teacher was banging on about. Show, don't tell. If I tell you that jealousy is corrosive, you nod along and, let's admit it, you forget what I said by about dinner. But if I show you a character being slowly eaten alive over 300 pages by jealousy, then maybe you'll remember. Because a novel can do something that a treatise structurally cannot. It can make you feel the idea before you understand it. And for certain kinds of philosophical claims, particularly ones rooted in the very nature of our being, it's not a nice to have, it's the whole point. And the second reason is bigger, and it's the one that I actually think matters the most. Philosophy, even at its most metaphysical or mathematical or logically rigorous, is ultimately about lived experience. It has to be. Lived experience is, after all, the only access any of us have to the actual world. And every philosophical claim, no matter how abstract, eventually has to be cashed out in terms of what it's like to be a person walking around making choices and basically just trying to figure out how to live. And the novel is the form that we invented specifically to capture some of that. So when a philosopher picks up the novel, they're not just slumming it. They're reaching for a tool that was explicitly designed for the job. And the third reason is that novels are a stress test. You can make almost any philosophical claim sound plausible in a 400-page treatise. You control the terms, you pick the examples, you define the edges and the cases and the evidence, all of that. But put your philosophy inside a story with actual characters trying to actually live it, and you find out very quickly whether your ideas survive contact with the world. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they absolutely do not. Readers too will quickly detect in that context if it is or isn't true to life or if it doesn't fit. And as we're going to see today, watching a philosophy collapse under the weight of its own novel is honestly one of the great pleasures of the form. So that's the theory. Some philosophers pull it off, some don't. Today we're going to talk about both. But before we get into the list though, there is one important caveat. This video is about philosophers who wrote novels, not novelists who wrote philosophical novels. There's a difference, and it matters, because otherwise the list gets completely out of hand. Dostoevsky, off the list. The Brothers Karamazov is one of the most philosophically serious novels ever written, and Dostoevsky was a profoundly philosophical mind, but he was a novelist first. And always. Same with Tolstoy, same with Hermann Hesse, same with basically anyone you're about to comment about right now swearing at me for leaving them off. Although please do so anyway, because we should probably have a video on philosophical novelists soon too. But these are writers who thought philosophically. They're not philosophers who wrote fiction. And if I let them onto the list, then the list stops being kind of interesting. Because of course a novelist can write a novel. That's what they're good at. That's not the puzzle. Now the puzzle is what happens when somebody whose day job is arguing about the nature of being or the structure of ethical life or whether other minds exist. You know, somebody who spends their working hours in the world of the treatise and the seminar. What happens when they decide, for some reason, to pick up the tools of storytelling and try to make it work for them? Sometimes that crossover produces something extraordinary. Sometimes it produces something that should never have left the desk drawer. That's what we're here for. Now, there are also a couple of edge cases which we'll get to as we go through the list. And this is probably where you're going to be the angriest with me, which is fair enough. I wouldn't call it cheating so much as making a good argument for a particular novelist or two to be classified as philosophers, because there are a few thinkers that sit right in the middle between philosopher and novelist, but that in itself is really interesting too. Still, you're welcome to fight me about them in the comments. In fact, please do. The algorithm thanks you. Also, while you're commenting angrily, please also consider liking, hyping and subscribing. Well, it was worth a shot. But before we get to the main list, here are 3 honourable mentions that I felt we couldn't skip. These are 3 books that don't quite fit either category, but that you might be interested in before we go any further. And in the end, I got an honourable mention. But first, what about Plato's dialogues? Yes, I'm betting most of you didn't see this one coming. Plato's dialogues get shelved in the philosophy section and taught to us as straight philosophical texts. But Plato's dialogues are not treatises. They're dramas. They have settings and characters. People walk in late, they get drunk, they flirt with each other, they get destroyed in arguments, and then they go away and sulk about it. The symposium is basically a dinner party, and the Republic is a conversation that goes on all night because no one can leave until they've figured out what justice is or something. These are functionally philosophical novels, 2,000 years before the form officially existed. What's interesting is that the dialogues are actually Plato's popular works, basically meant to be accessible to ancient Greek normies and not for pedantic obsessives like me. His technical philosophical works are lost to us, which, again, careless of us, as I said about Aristotle recently. So all we have of Plato is the fun stuff, which is a problem when you're trying to argue about the doctrine of the forms or the demiurge, and all you've got to go on is a dinner party chat. Maybe one day we'll find those lost works down the back of the couch again or something like that. We can only hope. So if you've never read Plato thinking of him as a dramatist, try it. The dialogues really read differently when you realise that he's also staging it. You could even try it with your friends. I'd love to, but I don't have any, because of Plato. Then there's Zhuangzi. The philosopher and the text named after him, which is one of the foundational sources of Taoism, is written about the 4th to 3rd century BCE, and it is genuinely one of the most fun philosophical texts ever written. It's full of parables and fables and weird little anecdotes. For example, a butterfly dreaming it's a man, and then there's a cook whose knife never dulls because he carves along the grain of reality itself. There's even a debate between fish and philosophers about whether fish can be happy. If you've read 1001 Nights, then you know this kind of rhythm. One story opens into another, and suddenly you've gone somewhere you didn't expect. It's not a novel though. It's too fragmentary and it's kind of too anthology-like, and it's too sort of stitched together across the centuries, but it contains some of the most essential philosophy of its tradition and some of the best philosophical counterpoints you'll find anywhere. Give it a read. Just don't expect a plot. Finally, there's Diderot's Jacques the Fatalist. Look, Diderot is an important philosopher. He's an encyclopediarist, he was a materialist, he was one of the key minds of the French Enlightenment, for example. And Jacques the Fatalist is an important book. It's genuinely ahead of its time. It's kind of metafictional and fragmented and constantly interrupting itself. Plus, it's wrestling seriously with problems like free will and determinism, basically 100 years before anyone else was doing anything like it. But it's also, sorry to say, a chore. I'm not going to lie to you, reading it feels like being trapped in a conversation with someone who keeps forgetting the point of their own story, which is fair because it is deliberately the point of the book. But deliberately unreadable is still unreadable. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Finnegan's Wake. So I can't put it on the nailed it list because I can't in good conscience tell you to read it. But I also can't put it on the failed it list either because it's doing something genuinely significant and what the book is trying to be, which it basically is. It's the only book in this entire video that I think is both a success and a failure at the same time. So weird, and also an honourable mention. But moving on, let's get to the main event, and we'll work our way from the bottom of the list, the least nailed it and the least failed it, to the top. And trust me, there are some controversial doozies at the top. She's a perfect 10. Kicking us off at number 10 is Soren Kierkegaard with Either Or from 1843. Now, full disclosure, this is not the most fun read on our list. It is a big, strange 2-volume thing. The first volume is a collection of essays and aphorisms and a novella called The Diary of a Seducer, which is pretty infamous. All it's supposedly written by a hedonistic aesthete we only know as A. The second volume is a pair of long, earnest philosophical letters from a middle-aged judge known only as B, arguing that his friend A really needs to get it together, needs to settle down, and needs to start taking life seriously. And the whole thing is then framed as having been edited by a third character called Victor Emerita, who found the manuscripts just handily lying hidden in a writing desk. It's pretty House of Leaves, to be honest, except the constantly shifting house is ethics? And it's a lot. Kierkegaard is constantly adopting fake IDs like he's on the run from the mafia and the feds or something. But here's why I genuinely respect what he's doing, why this book kicks off the Nailed It list. Kierkegaard is an existentialist, arguably the first one. And if you're an existentialist, then you believe that everyday experience, and more fancily said, our modes of being, are the absolute stuff of philosophy. Existentialists think that you can't do ethics in the abstract. You have to do it in real life. You have to do it by showing what it actually feels like to be a person trying to live one way or another, which is why Kierkegaard doesn't write us a treatise on the aesthetic life as such. Instead, he gives us an aesthete, A, with his seductions and his boredom and his clever little essays on Mozart, and lets us live inside his head for a few hundred pages. And we discover that the aesthetic life is a trap. If you live by the aesthetic sword, you also die by it. You get the pleasures, sure, that's great, but you also get the boredom, the longing, the pain, the shortcoming. It's not all drinks and nightclubs and fun. A is clever and sensitive, and he's miserable, and his misery is kind of the whole argument of the thing. For me, this is about the best critique of living as a purely aesthetic being as you will ever read in literature, and it works because Kierkegaard doesn't tell you it's a trap. He lets A show you. And then you get Judge B, the ethical life, which is stuff like commitment, marriage, moral responsibility, actually showing up for the people in your life. The judge gets most of the stuff that actually matters in life. But Kierkegaard is also careful to show what's missing even here as well. He sets up a third mode of existence, which he'll explore in his subsequent writing, Fear and Trembling, the terrifying religious mode of being. But that is another video for another day. So what makes either or work for me is that it's doing philosophy through fiction, rather than with fiction as a delivery mechanism. You don't read A's diary and then get a lecture on what it meant. You read A's diary and the meaning is in the diary. That's the move, and almost nobody pulls it off as well as Kierkegaard does here. So my advice for this Nailed It book is maybe go and read The Diary of a Seducer first. Penguin publish it as a standalone novella, and it's the most accessible part of the book. And if you like it, if it grips you, then go back and do the whole thing. It's really interesting. Now at number 9 we have Thomas More's Utopia, written in 1516. Many have heard of this book, few have read it, and there's a very good reason for that. Imagine your most in-too-deep Catholic friend corners you at a party and says, "Let me tell you about a wonderful place." He proceeds to describe a commune where everyone is happy and life is perfect, although why is never really argued for or reasoned out or demonstrated at all. It just is. Everyone has agreed to do things his way, which is the right way, and that's the end of it. Now, this could actually be fun. If there was some tension, if there was, say, a young girl who rebels against the perfect commune and who runs away and faces the outside world and comes to realise that the home she fled was paradise, that she didn't know what she had until it was gone. And then she spends the rest of the book fighting her way back, finally falling into the warm embrace of family and friends in the final pages, glad to be home. That's not Thomas More's Utopia. No, in Thomas More's Utopia, that girl is burned at the stake as a witch, and then we go back to hearing descriptions of how many buttons there are on each citizen's uniform and where exactly everyone sits at the communal meal. It's a dull book. It's amazingly dull. And if it was ever put into practice, I'm convinced that the populace would immediately smother themselves to death with their own pillows. Now, before you come at me in the comments, yes, I know, Utopia is important. It brought the word utopia into the English lexicon. It launched an entire literary genre. It's taught in every political philosophy course on earth, and there is a legitimate scholarly argument that the whole thing is actually a bit of a satire, that Moore is not endorsing this boring hellscape, he's making fun of it, and the joke is on the reader who takes it seriously. To which I say, if that's the joke, it's been 500 years already and nobody's laughing. It's time to pack it in. Because this is is a book that fails as a novel because it has no novel in it. There are no characters with interiority, there's no conflict, no stakes. It's just a man describing a place at length with an enthusiasm that is genuinely alarming. Moore had interesting ideas about property and justice and religious tolerance, for example, real ideas worth engaging with. He just buried them inside one of the most tedious documents ever produced by the Western mind. So, bonus content. If you want a great read and genuinely one of the best portrayals of Thomas More, the man himself, in all of literature, then check out Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. Now that is a banger. Number 8, Voltaire's Candide, 1759. So, have you ever read an opinion piece or watched a YouTube video that was so wrong and so stupid that you brooded on it for days, that you bored your friends talking about what an idiotic take it was, even though your friends have no idea what you're talking about and frankly would like you to stop? Yeah. Voltaire's been there too. Except Voltaire turned his incandescent anger and frustration at the hypocrisy of the world and the idiot handmaidens who helped birth it into this funny little book that sets their arguments on effing fire. Here's the backstory. In the early 18th century, Leibniz and a whole bunch of rationalist philosophers were going around telling everyone that it was perfectly logical that this was the best of all possible worlds, that God is good, God is all-powerful, therefore the world God made must be the best version available, and all the suffering and cruelty and injustice you see around you is actually a part of a grand, optimal, divinely engineered plan. You just can't see the big picture, you fool. Voltaire thought this was moronic, and rather than write another treatise about it, he wrote Candide, a short, savage, hilarious little novella in which our hero Candide and his beloved Cunegonde lose absolutely everything. There's war, there's earthquakes, con artists, slavery, the Inquisition, an astonishing number of beatings, and running alongside them the whole time is Candide's tutor, Dr. Pangloss, who after every fresh catastrophe insists with total sincerity that this is still the best of all possible worlds. It's one of the funniest books ever written, in my opinion, and it's also one of the most morally serious, which is a very hard combination to pull off. And here's why it works, for me at least. Candide is not just a satire, it's also a demonstration. Voltaire could have written an essay arguing that Leibniz's optimism doesn't survive contact with reality, but instead he puts the philosophy inside a character, and then he drags that character through reality and lets you watch the philosophy break. Every time Pangloss opens up his mouth, the gap between what he's saying and what is actually happening on the page gets wider and funnier until eventually the whole worldview just collapses under its own weight. You don't need to be argued out of Panglossian optimism. You just need to watch Pangloss try to maintain it while being hanged. That's philosophy stress-tested through fiction. Exactly the thing that we talked about at the top of the video. It's also short, it's propulsive, it's genuinely funny, still 265 years later. And it's the rare case of a philosophical novel that actually won the philosophical argument it was picking. Nobody defends Leibnizian optimism anymore. Candide killed it. And also, it's been turned into an opera by Leonard Bernstein, and that is even more fun.
Please picture me in the trees.
Number 7, and we're back to the fails already. Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea, published in 1938. Yes, we get it, Sartre. Things happen by accident and not for determined reasons. So why do we have to spend so much time in a book that is absolutely too long, trudging around with the world's least interesting and least charismatic failed biographer, repeatedly finding out that stuff just exists in the world and that existence precedes essence, and that none of it has any reason for being there? We're accidental people in an accidental world. I got it in chapter 1, Sartre. I got it from the title. I got it from the back cover blurb. This is the philosophical equivalent of "this meeting could have been an email." And unfortunately, it's just about as much fun. Jean-Paul Sartre is usually a really great writer of fiction. We'll leave his philosophy aside for the minute. And he is a great dramatist. My favourites are actually his autobiographical works, like The Words, for example, which is fantastic. His plays like No Exit are tight, they're muscular, and they're philosophically brutal. The man really knew how to construct a scene. But his most famous novel is a one-note bore, and the one note can be summarised in a single line. Existence precedes essence. That's it. That's the whole novel. And the hero sits around in a cafe in a provincial French town and slowly realises that things exist without reason, including him, and this makes him want to throw up for 300 pages. You miss meeting no interesting characters by skipping this book. You miss no plot. You miss no jokes. You miss, at most, a chestnut tree. And the really frustrating thing is that Sartre's own philosophical partner, Simone de Beauvoir, who we'll get to in a moment, was writing existentialist fiction at the same period, at the same time, that was doing everything Nausea was trying to do, but better. With characters, with relationships, and with stakes. Camus was doing it too. Both of them took existentialism into fiction and made it breathe, brought it to life. Sartre took existentialism into fiction and made it tiresome. Plus, here's my theory on why Nausea fails, and I think it illustrates something important about this whole video. Sartre didn't trust fiction. In this case, he used the novel as a vehicle for ideas that he kind of already worked out, rather than letting the novel itself do the philosophical work. Everything in Nausea is there to illustrate a thesis. Nothing is in its own terms allowed to breathe, and the novel, as a form, punishes that. It can tell when you don't respect it. The far more fun and interesting novels of de Beauvoir and Camus are right there on the shelf next to it. Read those instead. Come back to Sartre for the plays and the autobiographies, but skip Nausea. And very predictably, here it is, you knew it was coming after the last one, number 6, Simone de Beauvoir, The Mandarins, 1954. Told you she was coming up soon. Okay, first, everything Simone de Beauvoir wrote I personally think is worth reading. All of her novels play a role in working out her own version of existentialism independent from the other thinkers she was in dialogue with, like Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus, Merleau-Ponty, the whole Parisian cafe, basically, if you will. Her first novel, She Came to Stay, is fun but a bit melodramatic. It overstayed its welcome with me a bit, to be honest, although it does have a fantastic twist at the end. It's also a fascinating document because it shows how much of Sartre's version of existentialism actually owes to de Beauvoir's keen eye for the character of human experience. A lot of his most famous examples from Being and Nothingness actually turn up first in She Came to Stay, including a fictional Jean-Paul Sartre jealously peering through a keyhole of his lover's door, which I mean, make of that what you will. But for me, the best will always be The Mandarins. It's a more mature work. De Beauvoir has her own philosophy strongly worked out by this point, the ethics of ambiguity, which I've done a video on if you're interested, which is very distinct from Sartre's. But I'd argue it's also complementary to Albert Camus' philosophy too, and it's genuinely her own. But the reason this novel works is that it feels like Hemingway in the cafes of Paris, except that instead of novelists, it's some of the most influential and creative philosophers of the 20th century. And they're arguing with each other in pubs and nightclubs, they're bitching, they're being petty, they're having affairs, they're falling out and falling back in, and all of it somehow adding up to a full and serious life. It's the stuff of actual human existence. It's animating a sensitive, highly relevant, and very human philosophy. And this is the contrast I was setting up a moment ago with Jean-Paul Sartre. Both of them are kind of doing existentialist fiction in roughly the same period, but where Nausea is one man alone in a cafe thinking about his own consciousness for 300 pages, The Mandarins is a whole world. It has multiple characters, real relationships, genuine stakes, actual politics, the Cold War, the communist question, what it means to be an engaged intellectual after the war. It breathes and it moves. It takes existentialist ideas about freedom and responsibility and bad faith and it embeds them in situations where you can actually watch the ideas being tested. It also won the Prix Goncourt in 1954, France's biggest literary prize, which is not nothing either. It's genuinely one of the best novels of mid-century France by any measure, and it also happens to be, I think, a masterpiece of philosophical fiction. That double achievement is pretty rare, but de Beauvoir pulled it off.
So what can I do? I really bag you, my lord. To me, flirting is just like a sport.
Now at 5, and brace yourself, it's the short stories of Bertrand Russell published across 1953 and 1954. Yes, those ones, Satan in the Suburbs and Nightmares of Eminent Persons. I know, most of you didn't even know these existed, did you? And there is a reason for that. Longtime viewers will remember that Bertrand Russell is one of my least favourite philosophers, so perhaps I'm biased, but I think he succeeded brilliantly as a mathematician and failed quite spectacularly as a philosopher. Even Wittgenstein, his own student, became embarrassed at how little Russell actually grasped once they got past the logic. The man was a titan of symbolic logic and a kind of amateur everywhere else he pointed his enormous, formidable intellect. His history of philosophy got a lot of people into philosophy, which is marvellous. But rereading it today as a professional philosopher, it's thin and it's biased and it gets a ton of stuff wrong. You know, classic Bertrand Russell. And apparently at the age of 80, he decided that the one place he had not yet failed was fiction. So he fixed that. Satan in the Suburbs was written in 1953 and Nightmares of Eminent Persons in 1954. Two short story collections published when Russell was in his 9th decade. And here is the thing that makes them genuinely, almost transcendently not good. Every character in them talks exactly like Bertrand Russell. Everyone. The devil talks like Bertrand Russell. Businessmen talk like Bertrand Russell. Housewives talk like Bertrand Russell. Children in these stories talk like a 90-year-old Bertrand Russell. It's like watching a ventriloquist who's forgotten he's holding the puppet. The plots are thin. The dialogue is stilted. The philosophical points, because there are philosophical points, this is Russell after all, arrive with all the subtlety of a brick through a window, and about the same level of welcomeness too. There is a story in which Satan moves into the London suburbs and bores everyone into misery. That's it. That's the story. You could argue it's a metaphor for something. I'd argue it's a metaphor for reading Satan in the Suburbs. These are books that would absolutely categorically have not been published if the name and the cover had been anyone other than Bertrand Russell. They are, in the most literal sense, vanity publications from one of the most famous intellectuals of the 20th century. And they are a perfect illustration of why this video exists. Because being brilliant at one kind of thinking does not in any way guarantee that you can do other kinds. I will say this for them though.
It was dumb. It was obvious. It was pointless. It was short. I loved it.
You can read one and laugh at it, which is not a thing you can say about like Atlas Shrugged. And actually, as historical curios, as an example of a major philosopher losing a fight with a form, they're kind of fascinating. Just don't expect good literature and don't pay full price. Now number 4 takes us to Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, published in 1943. Okay, while you're typing away at that furious comment, yes, I'm aware that this is a controversial pick. And yes, I'm aware that Rand is a controversial figure and there's a debate about whether she is a philosopher at all. She's known as a novelist, but she did build an entire philosophical system, objectivism, and she built it through her novels. I'll grant you, it's not very good, but it counts, for the purposes of this video at least. And be careful with this argument, because if it knocks Rand off here, it might also knock off one of your favourites higher up the list too. And I think the key thing is that Rand provided the intellectual inspiration, or maybe just the self-interested justification, for an entire political economic movement in the United States and increasingly around the world. And whether you agree with her or not, and I really, really don't, she has to be reckoned with. The best of her novels, for my money, is The Fountainhead. And I want to be clear about why. I disagree with almost every element of Rand's philosophy. I think objectivism, when you actually press on it, falls apart pretty quickly. I think the political movement that's grown up around her has done significant damage to the world, and yet I found this book fun and persuasive. That is a difficult thing to admit, and I think it's genuinely an interesting thing about the book. Howard Roark, or Roark, it's not really clear to me how you're supposed to pronounce that, seems to have true strength and real judgment. And unlike in some of Rand's other novels, she doesn't hide his flaws or the pitfalls of her own thinking. She lets him be difficult. She lets the costs of his worldview actually be seen. She reckons in this book with hard choices in a way that she mostly stops doing in her later work. And I think there's a reason that so many high school and college students fall in love with Rand through this book. It speaks to a kind of philosophical romanticism. I'm not immune to it myself. It's a desire to do great things, to make a difference in the world, to do it on your own terms, and to not be crushed by the mediocrity or the negativity around you. And look, whether or not you end up agreeing with where Rand takes that romanticism, the impulse itself is real and it's a meaningful one. It's part of how you start building your own philosophy for a lot of people. So The Fountainhead is a riveting starting point. It's a place on the map that most thoughtful people pass through at some point in their lives, especially when they're young. The trick is maybe not staying there. But then you could say the same thing about some forms of existentialism too. So yes, Rand nailed it. Read it, fight with it, then move on.
Oh, my darling, not 3 times on the ceiling if you want me.
And right behind it, at 3, same author, very different outcome, Atlas Shrugged from 1957. If the Fountainhead knocked it out of the park, then this one not just strikes out, but is a flat no-hitter, a complete shutout of a game. Because Atlas Shrugged is retreading a lot of the same ground of the Fountainhead, but at triple the length, with much thinner characters, some of the most horrifying romances in all of 20th century fiction, and what is essentially the ultimate wet dream of post-Fordist capitalism, Galt's Gulch, which to me always sounded like a wartime illness or something like trench foot, except, you know, back there. The idea being that the brilliant titans of industry, the real producers, the makers, not the takers, will one day abandon us ungrateful, impoverished wretches and start their own paradise, and then where will we be? Well, realistically, we'd finally be left alone and we could have nice things like universal healthcare and a progressive taxation system. And they would be, well, in Bioshock's rapture, basically. So good luck with that. But there's a reason Rand's editors begged her to cut sections of the book, including the 70-page speech that John Galt gives to the entire world near the end of the book. 70 pages of speech. She refused. The speech stayed, and the speech is still there. If you picked up Atlas Shrugged right now and flipped towards the end, you will find 70 pages of one man explaining objectivism to you in character form, which is to say, not in character form at all, because the point is that the character is just Ayn Rand with a different haircut yelling at you. And what did you do to deserve this? Well, you read Atlas Shrugged. And it's confession time. I've read this book twice, and I have finished it both times, but with caveats. Because the first volume is actually fun. It's a pulpy whodunit with some railroad stuff, and I genuinely enjoyed it. The second volume gets repetitive, and then the third volume is interminable. Both times I started reading, and then I hit John Galt's speech, got a few pages in, and I skipped it. So, can I say I have truly read the book? Tell me in the comments below. But here's my tip. If you do, and you're lucky enough to have the means, then get this chonky boy. This is the Folio Society edition, and this is, wow, an absolutely beautiful edition in my opinion. This is actually why I read it the second time. It's, in my opinion, frankly, one of the nicest editions that the Folio Society ever produced, hence my reading it at my own peril a second time. If it isn't too much of a stretch and you really want to read it, I love this edition. Read book 1 is my advice, and keep going, but honestly just stop when you stop having fun. Do not be a completionist. The book will not reward you for finishing it. So, same author, same philosophy, same decade basically, and yet the Fountainhead works and Atlas Shrugged doesn't. The difference for me is almost a perfect case study for this whole video. The Fountainhead puts the philosophy inside a character who actually has to live it, whereas Atlas Shrugged has the philosophy deliver itself to the reader in a monologue for 70 pages. One trusts the novel, but the other uses it as a megaphone. And as readers, we notice the difference. So at number 2, and you knew it was going to be on here somewhere, Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, written across 1883 to 1885. Okay, here we go, buckle in. This is the one where half of the comments section turns on me. Friedrich Nietzsche is possibly one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived. His aphorisms and his essays are the absolute best. They puncture, they cut to the quick, they rearrange how you see the world almost in a single paragraph or even a single sentence sometimes. The Gay Science, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals, The Twilight of the Idols, these are masterpieces. These are Nietzsche at full strength, and it's one of the most thrilling minds in the history of Western thought. So, can we please finally admit that his poetry is not very good and his attempts at illustrative fiction are frankly a bit boring and unbelievable. Thus Spoke Zarathustra never decides whether it wants to show you or to lecture you. Sometimes it's a fable, sometimes it's trying to draw from real life, sometimes it's pretending to be the Book of Ecclesiastes, sometimes it's pretending to be Wagner. It lurches between registers without warning, and none of the registers are really doing what they need to do. The characters are thin, the central character Zarathustra himself is an easily decoded bore with exactly one pitch, which is the Übermensch is coming and also God is dead, and also here's another extended metaphor involving animals for some reason. The historical references are clunky rather than smart. The prophetic voice, which Nietzsche is clearly in love with, reads like someone doing a sincere Bible impression without any of the weight or the strangeness of the actual Bible. And I understand why so many people start with it. I really do. Your first encounter with Nietzsche can be intoxicating. The idea of "Thus spoke Zarathustra," that a prophet descends from the mountain, announces the death of God, proclaims the next stage of humanity, is one of the coolest pictures in all of philosophy. And similar to the birth of tragedy, which in my opinion is Nietzsche's other dud, it has an aura of being an essential Nietzsche text. The big one, the one you're supposed to read. But we can admit this, they can't all be bangers, Nietzsche. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is for me a trudge, and it's a trudge without much illumination. And here's also why I think this one fails, and why it's the number one fail on my list. Nietzsche, of all people, the philosopher of stylistic intensity, the man who understood better than almost anyone how you say something shapes what you say. This guy didn't trust his readers with the ideas directly here. He reached for the mythic voice because he thought that his ideas needed grandeur. He thought that the Übermensch and eternal recurrence and the death of God required scripture or required a prophet, that they required Zarathustra on a mountain, and they didn't. The ideas were already faithfully doing the work. They are philosophy, not theology. But the prophet is kind of the literary scaffolding that Nietzsche couldn't bring himself to take down. And when a philosopher writes a novel to make their ideas bigger like this, I find that the novel almost always makes them smaller, because the novel is not a megaphone. The novel is a lens. Nietzsche, of all people, should have known this. So I hate to admit it, but there it is. Nietzsche failed it.
One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do.
And at number one, it has to be, and you knew it was coming, you knew it was going to be here if you know anything about me, Anything by Albert Camus. Maybe not a surprise to some of you, and I cannot choose. I have tried, but I can't. Every book Camus wrote is kind of a marvel. Everyone is soaked in the lived experience and the hard-won thought of a man who had an absolutely difficult, absolutely profound life, and who never, at any point, stopped fighting for the dignity of other people. You can feel that in every sentence he wrote. It's not a pose. It's not a literary voice. It is the man. It's in the silence of his deaf mother, or the sunlight of war-torn Algeria and his heartbreaking revisiting it. It's the journalist who risked death, who wrote for the resistance in the Second World War, who made himself unpopular with most of his frankly dickish friends because he would not abandon what he believed in. That is in every word. I'm recommending anything by Camus for a few reasons. First, practically, his books together are probably shorter than Atlas Shrugged, which is an embarrassing fact for literary history, but a genuinely useful one for your to-read pile. Second, Camus was a philosopher. He claimed not to be. He insisted he wasn't. But the coherence, the consistency, the importance of his message, the spirit of his thought across his essays, his journalism, his activism and his fiction says otherwise. You don't accidentally construct a complete ethical worldview across 30 years of work. He was a philosopher. He just didn't want the job title, probably because he'd seen what had happened to the other people who did. And third, and this is the real reason, Camus' works are a ladder. Each one builds on the last. The Outsider and the Myth of Sisyphus open the door with the absurd. The recognition that the universe is silent, that meaning is not waiting for us anywhere out there, and that we're on our own. Then the Plague and the Rebel walk you through what to do about it. Things like measure, solidarity, revolt, fidelity to your commitments, care for the other people suffering around you. And then the Fall is the dark mirror. What happens to a person who sees all of this and fails that test anyway? And then there's The First Man, the unfinished novel of his death, which was going to be the homecoming, the return as an adult to the world and to the people that made him. It was sadly cut short. To stop at any one novel would be to capture only one rung of that ladder, and the ladder is the point, I think. But the reason Camus is number one, above all of the brilliant and flawed writers we've talked about today, is something really much more simpler than all of that. It's the sheer, for me, realness of his characters, the believability of the situations they find themselves in, and it's also stuff like the weight of the choices they have to make. You read a Camus novel and you feel more than anything that he's simply just showing you life with extraordinary, sometimes almost unbearable clarity. And it's only later, sometimes days later for me, when it dawns on you that the whole time, underneath everything, the heart of his philosophy has been quietly beating. That's what it looks like when a philosopher nails the novel. It's not ideas bolted onto a story. It's not a thesis delivered through a character's mouth. It's a whole world, fully inhabited, in which the philosophy is so completely dissolved into the life on the page that you can't separate them anymore. And maybe you don't really want to. So my advice is start with The Outsider, then read The Plague, then keep going if you want to. And actually, speaking of The Outsider, in a few weeks, we're going to do a full episode on it. The novel that kicked off all of this for me and for a lot of other people too. So if this video has put you in a mood, good. Come back for that one. It's going to be special. So Camus, number 1. It wasn't even close. So, 10 books. 5 nailed it, 5 really didn't. 3 honourable mentions along the way. And if you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that the failures almost all share one thing in common. The philosophers who failed as novelists were the ones who didn't trust the novel, the ones who used it as a megaphone for ideas they'd already worked out, rather than letting the form do its own work. Sartre lecturing you through his hero, or Rand building a 70-page speech into Atlas Shrugged. Nietzsche reaching for scripture when aphorism would have served him better. Who knows what on earth Russell was doing, but they failed because they treated fiction as a delivery mechanism. The ones who I think succeeded, Kierkegaard, Voltaire, de Beauvoir, Camus, even Rand at her best, trusted the novel to do philosophy for them. They embedded the idea in a life and then they let the life carry it. That's the trick. I suspect that's always been the trick. Now, a quick pitch before we go. One thing that has kept coming up as I was researching this video is that some of the greatest philosophical novels ever written, in fact, the majority of them, weren't written by philosophers at all. Dostoevsky, obviously, but Roberto Bolaño, for example, or Marilyn Robinson, or Borges, or so many others. And also huge amounts of extraordinary philosophical fiction is there from non-Western authors, from writers working in traditions that never really drew that hard line between literature on the one hand and philosophy on the other that Western academia insists on. So there's a whole other video in there. Novelists who did philosophy, kind of ranked the same way maybe, best and worst. If you want that video, then please tell me in the comments. If you're interested, I'll make it. And while you're down there, tell me, who did I get wrong? Who did I miss? What pick are you furious about? I know Nietzsche's going to cost me some of you, so don't let me off the hook down there. But until next time, be wise and be kind, and happy reading.